we'll turn it over to you, Michael. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, here we go. Well, yeah, that is a pretty good introduction. I became interested in Native Americans somehow as a child. I wanted to be an Indian when I was 4, 5, and 6 years old. And I gave up on that ambition only under pressure from my parents who are of German and Ukrainian background. But then when I first visited St. Vladimir's as a student at Georgetown, considering seminary at the time, not sure I was even going to go there, I encountered a student with a wall map of Alaska on his wall, covered with pins. And I was intrigued by this. I asked him, Bob, are you doing voodoo on the state of Alaska or planning a military invasion? And he said, neither. I'm planning to go there as a missionary. And I said, wait a minute, they're Native Americans who are Orthodox? He said, of course, you know, it was part of the Russian Empire for nearly 130 years. This had never crossed my mind. So I resolved, this I've got to see. And then I gave up trying to get a job in Alaska that summer. The economy was so bad. The state had an information booth at the Seattle airport discouraging people from even going there looking for work. And so I was completely discouraged and thought, well, I guess I'll have to go to Alaska some other time. When a letter came from this village, we haven't had a priest since Father Herman died in 1837. These are patient people. I'm the volunteer, I'll go. And I got chosen, and it was a life change. At the time, I didn't realize it, but it was a life-changing event. Then I began reading Alaska history. Now, Alaska history was never well researched. Hubert Bancroft wrote the first history of Alaska in the 1880s, less than a decade after Alaska had become American territory. And he never came to Alaska. He didn't speak Russian. He had to rely completely on informants to supply him with information. And as it turns out, they made most of it up. The history of Alaska, the Russian period, has never really been researched properly. And so it's a new frontier. I wasn't aware of this at the time. But the point here is the Bancroft history paints the Russians in the blackest possible terms. They came here and they plundered the place, they enslaved the people. And after they were done exploiting the resources, they gave it up to the USA. So my question almost as soon as I got there was, if the Russians were so horrible, and if conditions were so deplorable for the entire 127 years, why didn't these people abandon everything the Russians had brought, including the Orthodox Christian faith, as soon as the Russians left? Why are these people so fervently Orthodox after all these years, when if the Russians were so, you know, such horrible taskmasters? So this intrigued me, and I began asking the elders, and they said, well, what the history books say isn't necessarily the whole truth. And they began telling me the history of Alaska from their perspective, which ultimately became my doctoral dissertation, rewriting the history based on first the native oral tradition, and then basically, as it turned out, corroborating that in Russian sources. Because the Russians were eyewitnesses of these events, and of course the Alaska natives were eyewitnesses of these events. And when their tale of their recounting of these events jive, when they mesh, when they reinforce each other, it's pretty clear that Bancroft was wrong. So the missionary history is something, well, relatively new to our exploration. What brought the Russian mission to Alaska in the first place was a kind of backhanded, backdoor kind of scenario. Gregory Shelikoff in 1784, a merchant in Siberia, decided to equip ships to bring entire shiploads of furs to Russia for the sale to the Chinese. It was a very profitable business. I'm told that the fur trade in those years was like oil today. Everybody needed a coat pretty much every year, and that meant everybody on the planet, at least in the less further from the equator you get, the more coats you need. so the Russians, the Chinese, most of Europe all needed a fur coat. It was the only thing that they made coats out of in those days. It wasn't a luxury item. So Shelikoff comes wanting to conquer Kodiak Island deliberately, quite deliberately. The Aleutian Islands had already been explored and penetrated by freelance fur traders. They came in skin boats about 20 feet long. You wouldn't want to cross most rivers in Europe in these kind of skin boats. And these guys were coming from Asia to the Aleutian Islands and trading with regular trading partners. But the voyage would take a year to prepare, a year to get to Alaska, spend a year in Alaska, and another year to get back, and then probably still a 4 or 5 year trek to come to Alaska, trade your furs, and return. And fortunes were made, even though these were frontiersmen with very little education or navigational experience. They were making good money and blowing it. They were actually coming back to Russia and squandering their fortunes. They were frontiersmen. They didn't want to settle down in the cities. The last thing they wanted was a mansion and a tuxedo and a season ticket to the opera. They squandered their fortunes and went back and did it again and again. Now, each voyage was a 4 to 5 year trek. So eventually, as they got older, they got tired of it. And they didn't come back to Russia to settle. They tended to settle in the Aleutian Islands and intermarry with local Unangan Alutiiq women. When the missionaries came, in fact, the evidence for this is that when the missionaries did come some 50 years later, there were chapels in every village, and the entire population had already been baptized. Baptized because the frontiersmen served as godfathers for each other's kids. And the missionaries then, as they came through in 1794, had mostly marriages. They were rather disappointed that they didn't have the chance to baptize anyone, but they were already baptized, as I say, as laymen by each other. And the godfathers were taking some of their godchildren to Russia for a visit and then back to the Aleutian Islands. So the entire Aleutian chain, which is 1,000 miles long, had been evangelized by laity. The first clergy didn't come until Shelikoff decided to conquer Kodiak Island. And conquer it he did. He brought cannon and armed men, not traders. These were mercenaries. They came to Kodiak because they expected resistance from the native people who wanted nothing to do with the Russian frontiersmen in the neighboring Aleutian Islands. So Shelikoff came and fought literally, well, it wasn't a battle because he attacked the settlement by surprise and we're told massacred maybe 100 to 200 people, mostly men who resisted him. He broke the back of the Kodiak Alutiiq people. And this is the village that invited me to Alaska. I knew nothing about this when I arrived. But then Shelikoff went to Europe, where he'd never been, and somehow got an audience with Catherine the Great. And in his petition, he wanted a monopoly. He wanted to put all these freelance fur traders out of business. He wanted control of the fur trade. He wanted to be knighted. He wanted federal Tsarist money to support his conquests. He wanted a monopoly of the trade, not only for Alaska, but Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. There was nothing bashful about Mr. Shelikoff. And in return, he offered to evangelize the Alaska people. Now, Catherine turned him down flat, except for this last offer. She said, I like this. You're asking for permission to recruit a priest to go to Alaska? But in his exaggerated report, he had claimed to conquer 10,000. I guess somebody still has their mic on.
Go ahead, I muted him, so go ahead.
Okay, so he claimed to have conquered 10,000 Alutiiqs, and Catherine said, well, you asked to send permission to recruit a priest to come to your settlement in Kodiak. I think that poor priest would be overworked. You claimed that you conquered 10,000 Alutiiqs. I gave you permission to recruit 10 missionaries. Now you have to remember that in 1784, Alaska wasn't even mapped yet. It was like asking people to go to the moon. And while you might find a young, zealous seminary graduate, it would be pretty much certain that his wife would not consent to go across Siberia to an unmapped, uncharted land in North America. And so Gregory gave up on that idea. He decided to recruit monks. celibate men of prayer, most of whom were not ordained, only one of whom had a seminary degree. But he did get 10 from Valam Monastery, the largest monastery in that part of Russia. It's actually on an island in Lake Ladoga, in what was Russian Finland at the time. It became Russia only more recently when Stalin grabbed that part of Finland in the Russo-Finnish War. In any case, these Russian monks from Finland were recruited. They had a send-off in St. Petersburg. It was quite the national event. And then while Shelikov was ordered to provide transportation for these recruits, Shelikov's idea of transportation was to buy these men new boots. They walked 8,000 miles from Moscow to Okhotsk, across the entire length of the Russian Empire. They got into a boat, sailed to Kodiak, where they arrived in September of 1794. It's just been the anniversary recently of their arrival, September 24th. And they went into a kind of culture shock because Shelikov had sown them really a bill of goods. He told them how idyllic conditions were in Kodiak, how the frontiersmen now and the locals were getting along so splendidly, when in fact it was the natives who were being exploited and virtually enslaved by his company and by Alexander Baranov, who was the company manager or governor. And Baranov's era lasted 27 years. So this was really a deplorable time in Alaska history. But the monks did almost nothing for the first year. They had walked across Siberia. And I think as they did that, we don't have any record of what they encountered, but it seems if you walk from place to place, and it's a time before Holiday Inns or Hilton hotels were even invented, the monks logically stopped in monastery after monastery after monastery across the northern Asian wilderness. And each one of these monasteries had been founded in its time beyond the frontiers of the empire, in the wilderness, where their only neighbors were Siberian native people. And the monasteries had taken upon themselves the evangelical task of baptizing those tribes, presenting Christianity to those tribes. So without probably consciously realizing it, by walking across Siberia, the Valam monks were reviewing the missionary expansion of Christianity across North Asia. They kind of had a lesson in missiology. Where do you start? And what they learned, apparently, it's obvious from the historical record, they learned to sit still and be quiet for a while. They learned to interview and learn from the Alaska Native people in this case, their mythologies and legends and something of their spiritual beliefs and their spiritual life. And so for about 9 months, they just listened and gathered information. And in May of 1795, wrote a lengthy report back to Valam about what they had learned about the people to whom they had been sent. It's quite obvious from their subsequent documents that what they tried to do was present Christianity as the fulfillment of what the Alutiiq people already believed. They looked for commonalities. And they discovered that the people believed in one supreme God, although he didn't have much to do with them. There was this one supreme God who was creator of heaven and earth. Well, we can take that off our agenda. These people only believe something of the same of what we also believed in the first article of the Creed. But the biggest problem was that that Baranov and his employees, his mercenaries, were hostile to them. They were mistreating the natives, and the native people had no one to turn to for redress but the monks. They came to the monks with their stories of abuse and oppression, and the monks began blowing the whistle on the whole fur trading operation. The problem here was that any dispatch from Kodiak that the monks sent had to go out on company ships. So that we know, it's quite clear again from the archives, it's almost delicious. There's a letter from Yoasaf, the head of the mission, the monk who was ordained archimandrite, or the head of a monastery, and had a seminary education. he wrote most of the dispatches at this early time. And he says, the abuses here are so legion, if I had to tell you everything, writing to Shelikoff, it would fill a book. But of course, they didn't have the paper and the ink to write such a volume. Baranov is writing to his superiors in St. Petersburg at the same time. And he says, these monks are causing me so much trouble. If I had to tell you everything, it would fill a library. So you can see from their own writing who's reading whose mail and how Baranov is desperate to cover up his misdeeds because what he was doing was blatantly illegal. They were ordered to treat the native people fairly and to pay a fair price for the furs. And Baranov was extorting furs. They were getting fur at gunpoint, threatening to not kill people, but blow up their food supply, their smokehouses and their caches, so they would be hungry in the winter if they didn't obey the order to produce or to harvest so many sea otters by sundown, this kind of thing. So writing to their spiritual superiors, to the bishop and to the monastery back in Valam, got to be dangerous because Baranov was reading all their mail. And that's why Father Herman retreated to Spruce Island, 4 miles away, and founded a hermitage. He lived there by himself. In fact, he dug a cave in the Alaskan forest. This is following the example of Anthony the Great in Egypt, who went to the Sahara Desert and found a cave, and also the saints of Kiev, who founded the monastery of the caves, the honeycomb of caves under the city of Kiev. Anthony and Theodosius of the caves of Kiev commemorated it every Orthodox Vespers, festal Vespers. In any case, he had his own cave, but he had to dig it himself. And it's where he was buried subsequently 50 years later. But he went to Spruce Island. We often glorify Father Herman as this great spiritual leader, which he was, and for his personal piety, which certainly existed. But the native people venerated him primarily as the whistleblower who continued while the others gave up and went home, or drowned in the attempt to go home and come back, as happened with Father Yosef. They went to Russia. Yosef was consecrated Bishop of Kodiak with permission to arrest Baranov and send him back for trial. But the ship carrying Yosef and the other monks sank. I have a colleague, Lydia Black, who wrote, of blessed memory, who wrote the classic book, Rewriting the Russian History of Alaska, finally, from Russian sources. The Russians in Alaska, 1732 to 1887. Lydia Black had her suspicions that the ship on which Bishop Yosef returned sank because Baranov had it sunk, knowing that the jig was up and he was going to go back to Russia for, and this was all at the doing of the monks, you see. So the monks, this was the unity of church and state in old Kodiak. They were at loggerheads from the very beginning. So the defense of the native people is part of the liturgical troparion to Father Herman. Defender of the oppressed. Nowhere in the liturgical text does it say who was oppressing whom, but those of us who lived on Kodiak Island know very well the oppressed were the Alutiiq people, and the oppressor was Baranov and his mercenaries. So Baranov's regime, having lasted 30 years, is the very center of the Russian era in Alaska history, and Father Herman was there to witness it, to testify to it, and then to complain, to launch official protests about all this to the authorities in Russia. And when he died, the Alaska Native people built a chapel over that cave, and they continued to make pilgrimage to his burial site. Father Herman made a few prophecies during his life, but his sanctity was revealed to the Kodiak Alutiiq people primarily after his death. Their visits to his gravesite and the miracles of healing that occurred there convinced the Kodiak Alutiiq people of his sanctity, of his holiness. And it was their letters and their reports sent back to Valam that led to his glorification as a saint, the first saint of the Orthodox Church in America in 1970. That's why I wanted to get to Kodiak in the summer of 1970, We were having the first canonization ever on North American soil, and I couldn't get a job. But the people of Kodiak, the people of Old Harbor, recruited me, and I got to attend those ceremonies in August of 1970. We actually have a portrait of Father Herman that a local Alutiiq person made of him. I don't know how good this is going to show up, but we actually know what he looked like. And there are descriptions of his personal piety and his humility, his Christian virtues, and also his service to the Alutiiq people during the horrific smallpox epidemic of 1834. It turns out, because now Russian archives are open and the borders, people have been doing more and more research in Russia about Father Herman's origins. It turns out he was married at a very young age, and his wife and children died in a similar epidemic. And because he had nursed them in his 20s before they all died, before he entered the monastery, he was kind of experienced in dealing with epidemics. And when he was in his 60s or 70s, when he was elderly, he was adept at nursing the sick in the Kodiak epidemic because he'd been through a similar experience much earlier in his own life. But the point is, here is this. The Mavala monks did a pretty thorough investigation of the spirituality of the Kodiak people. You have sacred stories about the origins of things. Well, as it happens, so do we. It's the book of Genesis. And our stories are written down. Within your stories, you have the ideals of what it means to be not just a good person, but a real human being. We have those stories too, and our ideal for the perfect human is the God-man Jesus Christ. And we've got stories about him too, if you're interested. You have ceremonies to celebrate the events in those stories. We have ceremonies to celebrate the events in our stories. You have native artwork honoring the animals whom you've killed and to whom you want to offer thanks. We have art and music to illustrate the stories not only of our sacred stories, meaning the Bible, but also the lives of the saints who have followed these teachings. And you have a shaman. Now, here we have something that you wouldn't think the Christians could compete with. Shamans were those rare human beings, men or women, whom was believed had undergone what we would now call an out-of-the-body experience. They had died and been resuscitated. They had been to the spirit world beyond, which we all get to enter at death, but they'd been there and returned from it. And this experience gave them prophetic and therapeutic powers. They made predictions about the immediate and distant futures, and they also were capable of healing the sick. Father Herman performed exactly the same function within the Christian tradition. And therefore, you could say he personified what the monks were trying to tell them. They had plenty of bad examples of Russian men mistreating human beings and treating them with violence and and every possible sin you could probably imagine. And now we have one man who stood for what Christianity taught, and he made it believable. He made Christianity for the Kodiak Alutiiq people an ideal they could embrace. He's responsible. His example, probably more than any other, maybe even alone, is what converted those people to Christianity, because they had so many poor examples of so-called Christians treating them so horribly. But Father Herman personified the best. And the miracles that occurred, especially of healing at his gravesite, convinced the Alutiiq people that this new tradition that had been brought by the monks was also authentic. It had the healing qualities that their old shamans had had. And therefore, there was a relatively smooth transition from shamanism to orthodoxy on Kodiak Island. But I don't think it was consciously engineered. It was like the providence of God that Father Herman was able to represent all that was preached by the others And he actually practiced it and became a real person, a Christ-like man whose example they could embrace and follow. So Father Herman dies in 1837. It's pretty much forgotten for the next century or more. It's the Alutiiq people who keep his memory alive, continue to visit his gravesite. And in Old Harbor, I would venture that nearly every family out of 300 in the population, probably 100 people had stories of Father Herman, healing or curing them themselves or some member of their family in the past, an ancestor. So his sanctity was so widely known and experienced that there was no disputing it anywhere on the island among the Alutiiq people. His glorification was pretty much exclusively because of their veneration and their keeping his memory alive when the rest of the world had forgotten nearly completely about the Vala mission and Father Herman in particular. Overlapping with Father Herman, maybe we should say two things. So the first two chapters of the history of the church in Alaska are first the lay involvement and intermarriage of the Aleutian chain, and the laity building the first chapels and baptizing their offspring, each other's offspring. And the second chapter is the importance of the personal example of even one true believer. That we often think, what can I do? One person in this tide of whatever, secularism or, well, in the third world, oppressive economic and political conditions, what use is there? What can be accomplished? And Father Herman shows that that the example of even one believer can have tremendous effect. Saint Seraphim, who actually had the same spiritual father in Russia, Father Abbot Nazari, Igumen Nazari, says, "Save yourself and 1,000 others will be saved." And this is exactly what happens in the example of Father Herman. There's no substitute for Christians living a Christian life when it comes to and even one is like a candle in the darkness. The darkness cannot overcome it. Overlapping with Father Herman for our third chapter is a very humble man, actually, a boy who was raised in rural Siberia, Anginskoye, a suburb, you could say, of Irkutsk near Lake Baikal, whose father had died and who was raised by his uncle. And his uncle happened to be the sexton, the starosta of the church. So he was at church regularly, but his uncle's primary activity was he was the town tinkerer, the fix-it man, the guy you called when your appliances, such as they were, when your shovel broke or your window was cracked, you called this man and he came and fixed things. So from a very early age, Yohan Popov, became interested in mechanical stuff. They say in grade school, he would take apart watches and reassemble them just to see how they worked. He entered seminary, which at that time was not a graduate school of theology. It was basically a high school level education. He was the valedictorian of his class, and the faculty wanted to give him a new name because Yohan Popov is like John Smith. There were other John Popovs in his graduating class. They wanted to distinguish him, and they decided to give him the name Benjamin in honor of the recently deceased bishop of Irkutsk. So he became Yohan Veniamino. And he married, and he was about to be assigned a parish in the Irkutsk diocese, when instead he volunteered to go to Alaska, actually without consulting his wife, Catherine. He writes years later that he came home and he didn't know how to break the news to his wife that they were going to Alaska, which for the most part was still pretty much unmapped. It was like going to the moon again. And so he picked up their 2-year-old daughter and said, "I wonder where these little feet will be playing next year." And Catherine got the message, John didn't. They were off to Alaska. They went to Sitka, where he began learning the Unangan language. He was assigned to the Aleutian Islands, almost 2,000 miles back where he came from, toward Russia. And by the time he arrived, having spent time among the Unangan Aleuts in Sitka, he was fairly fluent in the language. He had already devised an alphabet for it. And he, with the local leader, Ivan Podkov, spent the first months of his ministry in the Aleutian chain translating the Gospel of Matthew into Unangan and writing it all down. And then he got into his kayak, which had to be specially built because he was 6'3" or 6'4". The Aleuts tend to be rather short men. So this huge man, he was called by one biographer Paul Bunyan in a cassock. He spent the next 10 years visiting the entire Aleutian chain, 1,000 miles of the archipelago, visiting the Aleut people, preaching to them in their own language. Now, he didn't have people to convert because, like we said earlier, they had been converted by intermarriage with the fur traders nearly a century earlier, but he opened schools. He taught people to read, and the people were worshiping in their own language across the Aleutian chain, as they do still to this day, even if they no longer speak their ancestral language, Unangan. Unangan is part of every ceremony because that's our history, that's our cultural background, that's who we are. And the Unangan take great pride, I would say, in worshiping, even to this day, mostly in English by now, of course, but also including Church Slavonic and Unangan in their services regularly, because they can do any part of any service in any one of those three languages. And it's something of their cultural identity and pride to be able to do so. So this is the 10 years of work of Ioan Veniaminov. The most extraordinary event, perhaps, in his career, excuse me, was an encounter with a shaman on Akun Island, which is no longer inhabited. The shaman told the people when he was coming and where to meet him, and they did. And these islands are small, but their coastlines are huge. The island may be only 8 or 10 kilometers wide and 5 or 6 long, but they'll have several hundred kilometers of coastline. And so for the native people to welcome him, put on their best, so he says their Sunday best, their kamalekas, the ones they usually wore only to church. They got all dressed in their finery, and they met him in this tiny bay where he was about to arrive. How'd you know I was coming today? How'd you know to meet me? Our shaman told us. Prophecy. Then he witnessed what could only be called miraculous at the hands of this shaman. And so he said, I need to talk to this guy. It's clear he makes prophecies. It's clear he heals. There's no denying that, but how does he get the power to do this? Where does it come from? And so he asked to meet with the shaman. The shaman spoke enough Russian for them to have a decent conversation. How do you know these things? And he says, my spirits tell me. What kind of spirits are they? And he describes them. They sound like angels to Father John, but he's not ready to jump to that conclusion quite yet. Do they ask you to worship them? No, they never do that. What kind of things do they teach you? The same as you teach. Can I meet these spirits of yours? I'll check. I'll get back to you. So Veniaminov then writes a report like this to his bishop back in Irkutsk. What should I do? I'm having second thoughts about meeting these spirits. If they really are angels, who am I to meet with angels? And so that's where, unfortunately, the conversation ends. He waits for permission from his bishop to proceed. It takes a year for a letter to get to Irkutsk and another year for the response. The letter, by the way, says, go ahead, I'm really interested in this, let me know. But by that time, the shaman has died. So I mentioned this just to show the kind of openness the Siberian missionaries showed toward the traditional religious beliefs of the Alaska Native people. They took their beliefs in shamanism and spirits seriously, but they followed the biblical injunction to discern the spirits. And Veniaminov was on the verge of believing, of affirming that this shaman was in touch with angels. The spirits that were guiding him were angelic. They were godly angels, not demons. And I mentioned this because it's one of those extraordinary events in the life of Father John in his early career. Then he was doing such a good job in the Aleutian Islands. They moved him back to Sitka, where the local Tlingit tribe had relocated. They'd been driven away by Baranov. There was a military confrontation between Baranov and the Russian naval vessel and the local Tlingits in Sitka, and they had moved away. But in the intervening decades, they had returned to their original homes in the area at Sitka. And so Veniaminov was reassigned to Sitka, where he started all over again to learn the Tlingit language, devised an alphabet for Tlingit, and began translating biblical and liturgical texts into their language. He sent all his manuscripts to St. Petersburg for publication. And years went by, and he finally got his books. But there were so many typographical errors that they were useless. There was no one to proofread either Unangan or Tlingit in St. Petersburg. And no one could make sense of Veniaminov's special alphabets, the diacritical marks and signs, and the special letters that he had invented for the sounds in both these languages. So about 20 years of work down the tube. Well, by that time, the Veniaminov children had never seen their homeland. There had never been a sabbatical break in all these years. And so the wife and kids sailed on a company ship to go home to visit grandma and grandpa in Irkutsk. And Veniaminov, Father John, got into a ship that took him to Hawaii, Sydney, Cape Town, Southampton, and finally Copenhagen and St. Petersburg. By the time he got to the capital, word reached St. Petersburg that his wife had died in a typhoid epidemic along with one of their children. His immediate response to this was to forget the translation work and head to Siberia to be reunited with his children. But articles that he had submitted to the local papers about the life in Alaska and the native people had been published, and the Tsar had been reading them. And Nicholas I summoned Yuan Veniaminov to the Winter Palace. He expressed his condolences, of course. And then Father John said, yes, I'm ready to scrub the publication project and just head back to Siberia and be reunited with my children. No, the Tsar says, we need men like you in Alaska. I want you to go back to Sitka as bishop. He was extraordinarily reluctant to accept this assignment, but eventually, after months, was persuaded. He was consecrated and given the monastic name Innocent in a Kenti. In the Russian practice, it's usually the same first letter. So he was Ioan, I-O-A-N, and he became Innocenti, I-N-N, and so forth. So he was given the name Innocenti because of the Bishop of Irkutsk. The missionary bishop there was Innocent of that city. So he was consecrated at the Mother of God of Kazan Cathedral, given lavish presents to take to Sitka, and funds to build a cathedral. And the fur trading company was responsible for building him a residence. It's still there. It's one of the oldest buildings in Alaska. It's part of the National Park Service here in Sitka. The Russian bishop's house, it's called. Veniaminov's desk is still there. The bed in which he slept is still there. The sofa and some of the furniture he built, and the clock for the mantle is still there. All that Veniaminov made while he was Bishop of Sitka. And he was doing such a good job there. This all-colonial school, the all-colonial school met on the first floor of the bishop's house. This wasn't just a mansion for a hierarch. It was the place where Alaska natives were going to be trained, not just as ecclesiastical leaders, but as navigators, sea captains, accountants, musicians, artists. Russians were forbidden actually to settle permanently in Alaska during this period. The imperial government was not interested in exporting Russians. Siberia was empty. China's right next door with 1 billion people. They were very nervous about this, and they forbade Russians to settle permanently in Alaska. What that meant was that Alaska native people had to be educated pretty much to run the colony. And it was Veniaminov's task to run the school to train them to do that. And it's another layer, you could say, of the mission in Alaska, where the church became responsible at the local level for teaching people the 4 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion. And then at the secondary level to run the all-colonial school in Sitka, where they were trained and prepared even for university careers. Sitka graduates went to the Russian Naval Academy in Kronstadt and became sea captains. There were Native Alaskans who were in the Russian military, one who became a major general and governor of a Siberian city, Ayan, years later. So you can see this level of education was beyond the Sunday school or missionary level. It was to train clergy and singers, choir members, and readers, certainly to serve the mission, but it was also to serve in the company and the colony in a secular way. When people say they are Aleut today, some of them speak Unangan. In fact, all Unangan speakers call themselves Aleut, but all Kodiak Alutiiq speakers also call themselves Aleut. There are Yupik Eskimo people in Western Alaska, much to my surprise, who insist that they are also Aleut. And therefore, the term Aleut is sort of like Swiss. You can speak German, French, Italian, or Romansh and still be Swiss because you have a unique history that separates you from Germany, France, and Italy. You have a story that makes you Swiss. I would say that the same thing occurred thanks to Yuan Veniaminov. Different people of different tribes became multilingual. They became literate in Russian and in their native language, and in the American period in English as well. The elders in the villages I visited in 1970 could read, write, and speak 3 languages a century after Alaska had been transferred to American rule. And this was due to the Orthodox mission as it was configured by Yuan Veniaminov, rather now innocent Veniaminov. We don't have any pictures of him as a young man because, of course, he wasn't a prince whose portrait would have been painted. And it's before the advent of photography, at least in his early years. But we do have pictures of Yuan Veniaminov with his son, who also became a priest, and his grandson, because his career continued. He was doing such a good job that they gave him Kamchatka, and he moved the seminary to Kamchatka. Having designed not only the Russian bishop's house and set up the educational system, but having designed St. Michael's Cathedral in downtown Sitka, which stands to this day. Unfortunately, this is a replica of his work because the original burned in the 1960s and was replaced by this concrete replica, a fireproof replica in the 1970s. But the clock for the clock tower was his handiwork as well. He built the clock for the clock tower. He designed the cathedral. He had a high school diploma. You see what an amazing person he was. He was doing such a good job. He was promoted to Archbishop of Yakutsk. You probably only know where Yakutsk is if you play the board game Risk. It's one of the coldest, most remote cities in Siberia. And he learned the Yakut language. He was already in his mid-50s. Devised an alphabet for it and opened the first schools for the Yakut. In 1868, he got a surprise telegram that he'd been elected Metropolitan of Moscow. And that's when we start getting pictures of him, because as a Metropolitan, they painted his portrait. And here's Yuan Veniaminov as Metropolitan of Moscow, where he built the Christ the Savior Cathedral, the original one, the one that Stalin dynamited and has recently been rebuilt since the Renaissance of Orthodoxy in Russia. But the original one was his handiwork. He was involved in building that as a war memorial for those who had died in the Napoleonic Wars. In any case, Yuan Veniaminov is rather extraordinary, a country boy with a high school diploma who learned 2 Native Alaskan languages, devised alphabets and published books in them, then learned Yakut, founded seminaries in several parts of the world, and then ended his life as the Archbishop Metropolitan of Moscow, and canonized as a saint in 1977 as equal to the apostles, because his whole life was an apostolic outreach of the church. So what this represents, of course, is that Native people in Alaska, by the time Alaska became American territory, Native people were pretty much running the church. They were running their own schools. They were operating their own hospitals. They were sailing their own ships because the Russians were not coming. And then the United States took over and pretty much neglected Alaska, I would say, for the first 20 or so years. But the gold rush, first to the Klondike in Canada, and more importantly, a little later to Juneau, made the Native Alaskans in 1 week minorities in their homeland. And this changed things radically. the intelligentsia, which were the Alaska Natives, the Aleuts, the people who call themselves Aleuts today, are simply laying claim that our ancestors were part of that culture, that intelligentsia that the church had pretty much created with its educational system. And the Treaty of Transfer said that all the Native people would be given citizenship in the United States as they had been granted citizenship in Russia. If you took an oath of allegiance to the Tsar, you were subjects of the Tsar, and that was equivalent to being a citizen. The monks swore the Alutiiq people in as citizens of the Russian Empire in order to protect their civil rights. So the Native people, the majority of them, in fact, were used to being treated like equals. And the Americans, of course, did not treat them as such. They went to court saying the treaty says that we're citizens. It's an unfortunate turn of phrase. The Treaty of Sale, of Transfer of Alaska to the United States says the Native people will be citizens except for the uncivilized tribes. Now, what that really meant, if we could show that map now. That meant was, what to the Russians, the uncivilized tribes are the ones in the north where there had not been, the schools are in all the places where those churches are located. All those places had local Orthodox schools. Before the sale of Alaska, teaching in the native language and in English. After the sale, adding English to the curriculum. But you see, the northern half of the state has no such contact. And so the uncivilized tribes from the Russian point of view would have been the Inupiaq, the Inuit in the far north, and many of the Athabaskan Indian tribes in the interior. But the people who lived in all these other communities would have certainly considered themselves civilized. They were reading books, they were sailing ships, they were playing musical instruments. The string quartet in Sitka playing Mozart and Beethoven were all Unang and Aleuts. So you see, these people had a sort of cult. They hadn't been deliberately assimilated into Russian culture, but they had learned enough of it to participate in the global economy. The northern tribes, the people above the center of the state, north of St. Michael's, had not been exposed to any of this. And the treaty obviously refers to them. The American courts, however, said that if you still speak your native language, you are uncivilized, thereby disenfranchising all Native Alaskans and making only them, well, the white people, the Anglos, were the majority now because there were 20,000 or more of them in Juneau alone. So the Native people were now outnumbered and couldn't vote. And so the church's mission, you could say, kind of morphed into defending the native languages and cultures, and on one hand, and also fighting for native rights, protesting the abuse of the Alaskan Native people at the hands of federal officials who refused to acknowledge that these people were citizens of the United States. And we have petitions written by the Tlingit chiefs in Sitka, by the Unangan residents, Ali residents of Sitka, to the President of the United States. They did not take this new oppression lying down. They had no much choice in the days of Baranov, but they'd been through this once before, and they weren't about to accept it again at the hands of the US federal government. So we have, for the next 50 years, the church, you could say, speaking up on behalf of the Alaskan Native peoples. In fact, Bishop Nikolai even went to the White House. I don't know how he got in, but he went to the White House and protested the way the people, Alaskan Native people, were being treated in the 1880s, 1890s, because he'd witnessed it firsthand as Bishop of Alaska. This continues to the present time, because I know we're running out of time, speaking of it, but to the present time, the biggest threat to the survival of a good chunk of our diocese, you see Lake Iliamna is on this map. At the headwaters of Iliamna, some mining company has struck gold, literally, gold and copper, and they want to open a gold and copper open pit mine at the headwaters of Lake Iliamna. Downstream from Iliamna Lake is the Nushagak Mission, and further down are the Unangan parishes in Bristol Bay. This is the home of the world's largest wild salmon fishery. Literally Tens of millions of salmon are caught there every year. It's the basis for the local culture from time immemorial, but it's also the basis of the local economy to the present day. The gold mine represents a threat to that economy and to the survival of those fish. The slightest trace of copper is deadly poison to salmon. So it has been the church that has led the defense of the native languages and cultures in this sense, standing up and saying, with a unanimous resolution of our diocese, we cannot sit silently by and allow a part of our homeland to be poisoned by the threat of this gold and copper mine. We bless the rivers. St. Innocent Benjaminov was the first to bless the Nushagak River in 1828. Early in his priesthood, he went to visit this area and baptized the first Yupik Eskimo converts. We've been blessing the rivers of this area for just short of 2 centuries. We call this land sacred. The possibility that they would be poisoned or polluted by the cyanide used in extracting the gold and copper leads us to say no, a very loud no, please don't do this. We would consider it a sacrilege. I must say the mining company really hated that word. They called headquarters in New York and they said, you know, your priests in Alaska are calling the threat of poisoning these rivers a sacrilege. Is that your theology? I'm not sure who answered the phone in Long Island, but fortunately answered, actually it is. They backed us up. And so we ask all the other churches, all the other mainline churches in Alaska to join us in our protest over the proposed, it's called Pebble, the Pebble project, make it seem like it was minuscule and tiny. It would have been one of the biggest open pit mines in the world, using cyanide to extract the ore, and with earthen dams holding back those poisoned waters forever. It's in a seismically active zone where an earthquake would have opened any of those earthen dams and poisoned, certainly sometime in the future, all of those, what we called sacred rivers. So the people of Alaska voted on this some time ago to declare this region a permanent fisheries reserve where mining would be forbidden legally. And it passed unanimously in every precinct in the state, city or rural, voted to establish this fisheries reserve and outlaw the mine, making it legally impossible. And then the EPA, the federal government, also said it would violate the Clean Waters Act, and we cannot approve the mine either. So it looks like for the time being, we've saved Bristol Bay from this possibility. But I mentioned this only to say that this struggle to stand up for the Alaska Natives and their native rights continues to this day. It started with Father Herman. It continued through with St. Innocent, and it continues through to the present day in this new form, in speaking out against the potential of polluting and poisoning the rivers that we have blessed now for 2 centuries and considered to be sacred to us. There's a lot more to be said, but I think my hour has passed. So I should conclude here.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Father Michael, and we will open it up for comments and questions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a button that's labeled reactions. And if you click on that and then put your hand up, I will see your hand and I will call on you immediately. Yeah, thank you, Father Michael. That's a big swath of history in a very short time, but really well done. In terms of the church today, is there any Russian influence that continues in terms of Russian Orthodox Church, or is the Orthodox broader now in terms of those that are working with the churches in Alaska?
You know, when the treaty was signed, it was a surprise to everybody. Seward and the Russian ambassador cooked it up in one night in his private residence in Georgetown. Congress passed it 6 months later, and everybody in Alaska was shocked that Russia was transferring Alaska to American rule. The Russians were given 3 years to stay in Alaska and become American citizens or
Yeah.
return. But none of them had come to Alaska planning to stay permanently anyway. And virtually none of them remained. By 1870, there were virtually no Russians left anywhere in the States. So the heritage, the Orthodox heritage, became an Alaska Native story. It's the Alaska Native people. We had, I think, a dozen churches in 1867. We have nearly 90 now.
Yeah.
And that growth had no external support or financial basis. The growth of the church is exclusively of Orthodox Native people moving to another town or intermarrying, like from the beginning, and deciding, well, we need our church. We can't bring our church physically with us from our home village. We're just going to have to build one. And we have villages where there are just 2 Orthodox families, and there's an Orthodox church in that village. So the mission spread because the Native people continued to spread it without any encouragement or any substantial financial support outside of Alaska. It's a pretty amazing story in that respect. It was locally homegrown. It became our faith, the fulfillment of our spiritual traditions, the one that respected even our shamans, and therefore spread to other parts of Alaska where it had been unknown. We're still opening churches exactly like that. People moved into Queenahawk where St. Juvenali was martyred. And 2 families are Orthodox, and the village says, we need an Orthodox church here, please build one. And they gave them the land to build one on, to build the church.
Well, a quick question on that then. Is Alaska its own patriarchy? And if so, who's the patriarch?
No, in the 1870s already, it was Veniaminov, 1868, when he was still Bishop of Yakutsk. He wrote to the patriarch, and well, there was no patriarch, it was the Holy Synod, the committee that was running the church in St. Petersburg. He says, rumor has reached me here in Yakutsk that I'm against the sale of our American colonies to the United States. Nothing could be further from the truth. I see this as a great missionary opportunity. If I were to be asked, and of course, no one had asked him, but he was getting his input. I would say, do not close the mission, but move headquarters to San Francisco. The climate is much better there, and this would be an opportunity for our church to penetrate the lower 48 states. And in the 1880s, they built a cathedral in Sitka, and from Sitka to San Francisco, and they appointed the bishop to live in San Francisco.
Okay.
And the seminary moved to San Francisco. And then in 1905, because of so much immigration to New York, they moved the headquarters from San Francisco to New York. But it was really the Bishop of Alaska who moved to Sitka, from Sitka to San Francisco, and from San Francisco to New York. And so our headquarters kind of is still in New York, and they appoint a vicar bishop for Alaska.
Okay.
But the founding of the church in America begins also in Alaska, and it's spread eastward from San Francisco to New York. We don't have a patriarch. We are one of the bishops of the Orthodox Church in America.
Okay. David, go ahead, unmute and ask a question.
Yes, Father Michael, you painted a very interesting picture of the encounter of Christianity with shamanism. But my question is, was the transition from shamanism to Christian Orthodoxy really as smooth or complete as in your description? Or was there some evidence of competition and conflict? I'm comparing your story with stories I know from Africa and from my own context in India, of missionaries working with the tribal communities in India. Missionaries and shamans have hardly ever got along well in other places. Many missionaries considered shamanism to be the worst form of paganism. And so is your story really exceptional?
Well, I think the encounter between priests and shamans, with St. Herman and shamans, and with Veniaminov and shamans is exceptional. I certainly agree. But, and shamanism persisted even among the Kodiak Alutiiq people into the 20th century. The point being that the church was willing to tolerate that. Not always, there was not always there was conflict, let's put it this way. But and I would say that on the Alaska Peninsula, just north of Kodiak, shamanism persisted into the 20th century to the point where there were people I knew who also knew shamans. It really disappeared. Shamanism, in fact, lost its credibility, I'm told, among the Alaska Native people during the Spanish flu epidemic 100 years ago. That the missionaries had, well, even St. Diakovan had vaccines against these diseases, and the ceremonies of the shamans proved ineffective against. And so it was the last epidemic 100 years ago that was also the demise of shamanism in Alaska. The Americans, however, you see, took a much harsher view. Sheldon Jackson, who was the Commissioner of Education, had shamanism declared a crime and had the shamans incarcerated. Tlingit shamans didn't shave their heads, so he had them shaved, basically defrocked. And it was a violent confrontation with shamanism, but it was led by the Protestant missionaries. The Orthodox were willing to let it die out gradually on its own because that was their experience in Siberia. Veniaminov did not go into shock smelling an unwashed shaman and seeing his uncut hair. He'd grown up in Siberia where such sights were common. Sheldon Jackson, the American, was born in Schenectady, New York. He had no experience with shamans. When he met a shaman, he thought there's something demonic about this, and had it oppressed by the federal marshals. So the responses, neither were. I'm told that the shamans, however, in Kodiak told the people to be baptized, that they themselves did not participate in the mass baptism when the monks arrived, but they told their people, go, listen to what they have to say, and do as they instruct. So there's some some evidence from the oral tradition and also the written that the shamans performed a kind of prophetic ministry, like Old Testament shamans or John the Baptist, saying there's one coming after me, greater than I, and so forth. And although they didn't themselves become Christian in the first generation, they didn't violently oppose it either, at least on Kodiak Island. So it's mix and match. There's places where, like on Kodiak, it seems to have been a very rapid transformation, although some shamans persisted and the practice of shamanism lasted another century. But the Orthodox seem to have been willing to tolerate that, knowing that they ultimately have the upper hand. and so we don't have, the Protestants were a little bit impatient. They had these people arrested and incarcerated and defrocked. So, but I didn't have time to go into this whole transition. There are martyrs and saints I had no chance to even mention in the 1 hour presentation.
Thank you.
Ralph, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, Father Michael, for again taking us to a world that most of us know very little about. I was interested in the what you said about the use of local languages, and wonder about translations of Bible and liturgy and things like that, and what's been done for the people in Alaska and when that happened.
Among the Alutiiq, they have the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles published in their own language in Veniaminov's writing system, and the entire liturgy, of course. So they can go to church and pretty much have a Sunday service completely in their own language if they want to. The problem now is that the vast majority of the younger people no longer speak Unaman. Among the Yupik, where everyone pretty much still does, it's the local clergy who have who graduated from our own recent seminary, St. Herman's Seminary at Kodiak, who have taken upon themselves to translate nearly everything into the Yupik language and publish it in the modern orthography. So they can have the entire liturgy and the scripture readings in their own language. But even there, the language, mostly under television, the influence of telecommunications, is being eroded by the media. And the younger children, I'm told in kindergarten, where they wanted to continue to use the local language, to use Yupik in the preschool classes, the children are refusing to speak their own language. They've been so inundated by cartoons and 500 channels on television that homes where where English was never spoken, now is deluged with the English language because it comes through the airwaves.
Right.
And so we're still using Yupik most of the time in most of our Yupik villages, but the handwriting's on the wall, unfortunately. I think to some extent we'll always keep it. It's part of the identity and heritage of the people. But that's true of the Slavonic we use too. Once you know the service all in English, you can switch languages just to show you can do it, but it's not essential anymore as it was in the days of Benjaminov and Netsvetov.
Thank you.
And go ahead, Alison. Go ahead, ask your question and unmute.
Nice to see you, Alison.
Yes, nice to see you, Father Michael. You've already talked about shamanism quite a lot. Could you say some more about the ways that kind of local native practices have been integrated into Orthodox practices? Are there particular examples you could speak of that perhaps persist to this day?
Yes, that's a very good. I would say our Christmas celebration, which is erroneously called Russian Christmas, it's on the old calendar, of course. Alaska's still on the Julian calendar, but what we do at Christmas in the typical village is the continuation of a pre-Christian tradition writ large. In ancient times, early January, late December was a time of ceremonial gathering. It's the darkest, coldest time of the year. You really can't do much because the sun hardly comes up, if at all, and the outside activities are limited. So it was the time of the year when people gathered to give thanks to the animals they believed had offered themselves, because you only catch the animals that give themselves to the hunter. It's not up to the hunter, it's up to the animal. That's the worldview we're dealing with. The animals are wise and smart, and they only approach the hunter whom they respect, and they respect the hunter who mutually respects them, meaning that they have a way of talking to the animal even before hunting, a way of creating weapons that are beautiful. The animal won't mind being killed by people who take so much care and make such beautiful spears or arrows or whatever the weapons are. That they know how to kill the animal without causing it any unnecessary pain or suffering. That they use the skin of the animal for clothing. That they use the meat of the animal for food. That they waste none of it. And whatever is left over that can't be used is also treated with respect. It's returned for sea mammals, for example, to the sea. But they return to the sea mammals to the sea that's frozen at that time of year. So they had this custom, gathering, whole village was gathered with other villages to share their resources, because by now they've done all the hunting and fishing for the previous year that's possible. And they hopefully have a surplus that they can gather, they can sing, they can dance, and they can offer thanks to God, but in a remote way, but to the specific animals in a very specific way, and return the parts of the animal that they haven't been able to use, in the case of sea mammals, through the ice into the sea. So when they saw the Orthodox priests blessing the water and cutting a cruciform hole in the ice and putting the cross through it, they say, well, that's the same stuff we do. But they put the image of their God into the water, where we're putting the animal part. In any case, what this meant was that Theophany and our Feast of Theophany and the native way of dealing with the animals harmonized. Also at this time, same time of year, not only were the animals remembered, but the humans who had died in that community the previous year. And in their memory, there would be a feast. And often gifts given in memory of those departed loved ones. Well, this continues to this day. The Russian Christmas feast begins with a Carpathian star, a twirling star, like a big pinwheel being brought to the house, with the choir members following it. They sing liturgical hymns, the Tropar, the Kandak. They sing parts of the Christmas canon from Matins. But they also sing, remarkably, a very long repertoire of Ukrainian kolyadi, Christmas carols. How these transmigrated from the Ukraine to Alaska, we have not ever quite traced its genealogy. But I'm of Ukrainian descent, and my Yupik relatives know more verses of more Kolyadi than I do, having grown up in that tradition. In any case, after the singing comes the feast and the gift giving. The feast and the gift giving are not part of the Ukrainian celebration. They probably wouldn't know any of this in Russia, except where they have some Ukrainian visitors or settlers. But it's become part of the Alaskan scene. That the town pretty much closes down, not just for 2 or 3 days, but for about 2 weeks. Every family who has lost a relative in the previous year is hosting a feast. So you go from house to house, day and night, for about 2 weeks. There's the singing of the Christmas repertoire, the blessing of the house with the holy water, and then the feasting and the gift giving in house after house after house. My wife says that when she was a child and the village was small, they could bring the star and sing in every house for 3 nights and be done. Now that the village has dozens more houses, the star can only visit each house once. And because people are more affluent, the feast has become several hours long. And the gifts, people are already saving up to buy the gifts at the Costco's and discount stores. Gifts that they will give in memory of their departed loved ones are being warehoused as we speak by now. They picked the berries for the feast this past summer. The meat, some of the caribou or the moose meat that will be served at the Christmas memorial feasts are being harvested now during the hunting season. So people wait the whole year for this once-a-year visitation of the Christmas star, but it's really the continuation of their ancient memorial feast that they've been having for centuries before Christianity arrived. And the church has never had any problem with this because we pray for the departed anyway. And if you want to give gifts in memory of your departed loved ones, it's okay with us. So it's probably the primary way in which the old Alaskan customs are preserved. And it's why even villages that don't have Orthodox churches want to have an Orthodox church, because that revives these ancient traditions in their community, and everyone participates, whether they're Orthodox or not, whether they're Christian or not. Everyone participates. It's called Slavic, not because of the Slavic languages, because of the word Slava, meaning glory in the language. We always start in every house with Slava Vishnu Bogu, glory to God in the highest, the Christmas hymn of the angels. So, and it's usually called Russian Christmas, although the Russians would be mystified if they saw this celebration themselves.
A question along that lines, Father Michael. What about the presence of the ancestors? Is there a sense of their presence in the service and in terms of recognition of that?
Yes, very deliberately. The starring, as it's called, the singing of the hymns, starts at the cemetery and ends at the cemetery.
Yeah.
And I remember recently, it sounds, like a medieval legend, but someone saying I was trying to catch up with the singers with the star, and I went to the house where I thought it was, and I heard all this singing going on, so I didn't enter because I didn't want to interrupt the ceremony. And I waited for the singing to stop, and when it stopped, I went in and there was no one there.
Oh, wow.
And they said, because it was our ancestors singing in that house.
Yeah. Wow.
And there's the story of Matushka Olga. Matushka Olga was the priest's wife in the village where my wife was born. And at one of the starring events, where the star had come in, the people were singing. There was her great grandson was taking pictures with a phone. It's not really a camera, with a phone. But when he reviewed his pictures, she was present. No one saw it while they were actually there, but in the photographs, her face and a golden light around it was hovering over the star and the singers while they were performing the liturgical hymns.
Yeah.
And this photo circulated throughout the Yupik Eskimo region. As more evidence, our ancestors are participating in this. They join us every year in this memorial feast.
Excellent. Any other questions or comments from anyone who's joined? Well, thank you very much, Father Michael. Absolutely a fascinating and interesting lecture. Also, I really like the question and answer because it just brought out all sorts of things in terms of the dynamics of that. And it touches upon so many areas, especially in the area of shamanism and the relationship, the ontological relationship between us and the divine, and and how that all impacts mission is very, very interesting. And I think there's so much fruit to come from that.
And the fact that sacred stories can be written down and you can have access to them, not just when an elder decides to tell the story, but anytime you can pick up the book.
Yeah.
It indicates that literacy took off in the, especially, well, among the Native people in general, but the Unangan people in particular, because they were eager to have access to the sacred stories. And the fact that they could get them from a book and could learn to read was like a phenomenon that led them to really love the sacred scriptures and to learn to read them and to even memorize them in their own language.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, one of the there's just a thing I've been looking at is the difference between Protestants' understandings of sacred scripture versus other aspects and lines within the Christian church. Because one of the things with a lot of Protestant missionaries is the idea of sign and signify requires a twofold conversion. One is in terms of a faith in Jesus Christ, but the second is an intellectual and also epistemological thing of going away from the ontological relationship between humans and things and words and things, so that it becomes separated. And what you've described, even at the tomb where they would go and be healed, is something that deeply resonant with many different backgrounds and cultures, but deeply tense within Protestant circles. But
well, sola scriptura kind of limits where you can get divine revelation.
yeah,
But there's a whole aspect here that people, the Yupik people, the Alutiiq people too, believe that there's a life force that makes each thing to be what it is.
yeah.
It's called the Yuwa in Yupik or the Inuwa in Inupiaq. And that life force is depicted in their art as a human shape. So you have a seal mask to show reverence and gratitude to the seals that offered themselves and died to keep you alive during the previous year or so. And that seal mask is very identifiably, very obviously a seal, but one eye is a human eye.
Yeah.
And the eye is the image of its life force. And the message is the life in the animal and the life in us is the same mysterious sacred reality.
Yeah.
The outer shape is different, but the inner reality is the same. So St. Maximus the Confessor calls that the logos with a small L.
Yeah.
And then you see how the two mesh again, even theologically, how a missionary could say, you're right, the life force in that animal is something sacred.
Yeah.
The life in everything is sacred, and it has a name, and his name is Jesus Christ.
Well, what a good way to end a perfect period on an excellent lecture. Again, thank you for attending and just so much appreciation to you, Father Michael. So blessings upon you all. And Ralph, you're next week.
I am, yeah.
So David Singh will be chairing and hosting because I'm on annual leave. But thank you so much for joining, and we'll have a good lecture from you next week, Ralph.
Hope so.
All right, so I will say bid adieu, and we will see you later.
Thank you,
Okay.
Father Michael.
Thank you very
Thank you very much.
Father Michael.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Tim.